All right, here we go. This is my first ever guest on the channel, and I've got Thomas Rowsell of Survive the Jive. So everybody go check out his channel if you haven't, but I'm sure you have. So anyway, it's good to have you here.
Great to be here, Christopher. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about Christmas, just the holiday itself, what we're missing out on when it comes to sort of the cultural roots of it. There's so many things that we engage in during the holiday season, and we have no concept of what the roots of them are. And I guess specifically as a Canadian, I'm coming from it from that sort of Walmart North American point of view, where we've sort of watered down or obliterated a lot of the sort of the I don't know, the meaning of this stuff. So you're a perfect guy to have on to talk about this. So
yeah.
Oh,
well, I've got lots to say about Christmas. So I'm looking forward to the talk.
Yeah. So where could we begin? Let's just start with like the most obvious thing, which is just Santa Claus, which is a huge thing that's going to go all over the place. But I think that's just, if there's some kind of like iconic dude behind Christmas, it's going to be Santa. So let's just start with that. And yeah, give me the rundown. What's he about?
Well, over here in Britain, we call him Father Christmas. We don't say Santa Claus. But in Holland, they call Sinterklaas, and in the lowland German countries, they call it Santa Claus, which is what in North America you say as well. And in France, they say Père Noël, which means the same as what we say Father Christmas. And he's really very, like right now, there's not that much difference between French, English, American, German. Santa is pretty much the same, just different names. There are some minor differences. But originally, there were different things entirely. And they've all kind of just merged into one thing now. So the American Santa is mainly borrowed from a mixture of German Santa Claus and English Father Christmas, but then American Santa's come back to Europe and then re-influenced the European Santa Claus and Father Christmas, so that everything's kind of become similar. But originally, obviously, a lot of people know that the name Santa Claus means Saint Nicholas. Saint Nicholas was a bishop in Demre in Lycia or Lycia. I made a documentary about Lycia recently, actually. I've been to his tomb. I visited it. It's popularly visited by Russian pilgrims who, he's a very important saint in Russian Christianity, actually. But it wasn't that important as much in the Western Church. But the actual reality of St. Nicholas doesn't have very much in common with what we understand about Santa Claus, because Santa Claus is this guy, he's fat, he's jolly, he's a white dude, he lives in the North Pole and he's associated with snow, whereas the real St. Nicholas was not fat. He was like an Anatolian from the Near East. He wasn't friendly. He punched Arius in the face for heretical views.
Well,
so yeah, it's quite a different kind of guy. But the reason for that is that saints in Europe kind of grew their own, the cults of saints in the medieval times went their own way and developed into totally different stuff, and like kind of merged with pre-existing like pagan beliefs and folk beliefs, or even just people made up new beliefs for them as they went along. And Sinterklaas in Holland has had that, but Father Christmas in Britain and I don't know so much about France, but the British Father Christmas has nothing to do with Saint Nicholas. He was just a physical manifestation of Christmas itself. So like we do that, we have something called Father Thames as well, which is like a human representation of the River Thames, Father Thames. So a human representation of Christmas. But Father Christmas now, the way we depict him now, looks just like you depict Santa with the red and white hat. But we used to depict him very differently. He had a big white beard and he was jolly. But that's about where the similarity ends. Or he had the white trim hat, but the hat wasn't red, or the coat wasn't red. It was more like green or blue or different colors. It didn't have to be red at all, his clothing. And he wasn't fat, he was thin. And he didn't have a sled. He never had a snow sled. He would ride on the back of a goat a lot of the time, and he would often be drinking booze. And so the main thing in Christmas for hundreds of years in Britain has been associated with heavy alcoholic indulgence.
Yeah, it's a crazy party, wild time. Yeah,
exactly.
It's over the top.
It still is a bit like that, but it's become a bit more child friendly, and that kind of child friendly version of Christmas that we have in Britain and America is heavily kind of engineered by Victorian England, that's an English invention of Dickens, because Dickens kind of wanted to make Christmas into something more Christian, because a lot of people thought it had been getting away from its Christianity. And even like the Puritans in Britain and America had tried to ban Christmas because it wasn't actually a very Christian celebration for hundreds of years. It's now such an important part of the Christian calendar, but it wasn't for hundreds of years. It was a Christian celebration, but if you went and saw it, it didn't really look very Christian. It was more about getting drunk than anything else.
Well, our idea of Santa, mostly like the modern conception that you see in advertising and everything else, that is basically a product from the 1940s. And who was it? Nast, I think, was the original artist. And then there was Norman Rockwell did some illustrations, but really it was those old marketing illustrations from the 40s and 50s that really cemented this idea of the big fat jolly Santa Claus guy, and that's what we're stuck with. But if you look at old postcards or illustrations from the 1800s or whichever, Santa Claus looks very different, and it's really just that we're kind of living in a stew of marketing right now, and it's kind of altered our idea of what Santa kind of actually was. And it was a crazy time. I mean, it was outlawed off and on. I mean, it was just everybody just getting wasted, going door to door, demanding food and drink. And maybe that's where caroling comes from. Is caroling part of that thing about going door to door?
Absolutely. In England, the calendar celebrations all year round were generally typified by the same kind of behavior, which is that groups of young men would form a posse and knock on doors demanding alcohol. And that is the origin of pace egging, which is an Easter thing which has gone out of fashion at Easter, which is basically knocking on doors and doing a little play or a dance and then saying, give us some booze or some cheese or some bread, something to eat. These people were very poor. It's the poorer people who, for that, they want alcohol and food a lot more than anything else. And in carol singing comes from that, or wassailing as it was also known. But wassailing also happens later on in January as well. We still have wassailing in the West Country here, but wassailing is basically carol singing. And also they had the same exact things in May. And in Britain and Ireland, the Halloween thing, trick-or-treating, comes from the same exact thing as caroling. It's just this groups of young people knocking on doors saying, give us some food, give us some alcohol, or we'll play some horrible trick on you. We might smash your windows, steal your door, take the door off the hinges and steal it and hide it somewhere. Or that's what that culture comes from. But both trick-or-treating and carol singing have all kind of been sanitized and also made more child friendly, although children have traditionally been involved a bit in Halloween in Ireland for a long time.
Well, I think there was a very different perception of children if you go back 100 years ago. Children were not this sort of love of the child, this sort of a Lewis Carroll sort of thing about like innocence. Well, who knows? I mean,
it's very Dickens. I think Dickens has a lot to do with it as well.
I mean,
children, with little Timmy.
Little
Timmy.
Yeah, you go back a little bit and you had, young kids were basically supposed to be little adults, and they
were getting drunk a lot. Like they were boozing and getting whipped and working in factories and whatnot. So
right. So with Santa, just to keep going with him, what about the origin? Okay, so when I think Santa, there's that Odin crossover, is there not? And
there certainly is, but a lot of the time people mistake what is an Odinic influence on Santa and what isn't. So
I would think the horse would be. I mean, you have Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse, then you've got a sleigh with 8 reindeer. To me, that makes logical sense to kind of cross that over.
It makes sense as well, because you're thinking reindeer come from Scandinavia,
of course,
but it's not. There's no connection. There's no connection to reindeer and Odin. Reindeer has no connection to Father Christmas in England. Traditionally, he rode a goat. And in Sweden and Scandinavia, their equivalent of Father Christmas, they didn't have Father Christmas or Santa Claus. In Scandinavia, they had Yule Log, this goat. And that would be a man would dress up, the father of the house would dress up as a goat and knock on the door and pretend to be the goat and give the presents. That tradition is now dead in Sweden, but they instead just make straw goats like this called a Yule Log. So they had that same thing of Father Christmas of giving presents, but it wasn't a man, it was a goat. And there's never been a reindeer association. The reindeer association is a 19th century invention. Donner and Blitzen, all these German names. There's no reindeer in Germany.
Well, see,
so it's not a connection to Odin at all. But
see,
there are.
I'm gonna keep going with it and say that there is, just because I feel like arguing. Just why not? So you've got Donner and Blitzen. That's thunder and lightning. So you've got a goat. So you've got, well, maybe there's a crossover with Thor as well. Maybe there's sort of an amalgamation of these different gods, because you've got Thor, and who's got a carriage driven by goats.
Donner is actually the German name for Thor.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's like today's Thursday, Thor's Day, German Donnerstag. It's a day of thunder, and you've got Donner and Blitzen, thunder and lightning. I mean, of course, those are later names applied later on, but I can't help but think that there's some sort of really messy, loosey-goosey.
I know it seems like
stew.
that, but you can explain it very easily by the fact that Romanticism was a very big thing in the 19th century, and that included like folksy stuff, getting in touch with the pagan old days. In Germany especially. So they invented things like this, and there was Christmas cards, and there was all this stuff of Christmas being invented, and that is when the sleigh and the winter feelings of winter, like the wintry things like sleds and reindeer and Scandinavian trees and stuff like that. This is all stuff from the 19th century, Germany and America. And the royal family adopted a lot of German Christmas customs in Britain. The British royal family did, and that's why we have them in England too. It's from the 19th century. They're not attested any earlier than that. Certainly not back as far as the 10th century or whatever, when pagans are around. I'm afraid the connection isn't there. I can say that I do think there is an Odinic influence on Father Christmas, and I'll say what I think it is. Firstly, one of the names for, as I mentioned this in our book that you have behind you, I say this, one of the names, that the epithets of Odin is Yule, which means Yule Father, literally Father Christmas. So it's exactly the same name we call him in England.
But that's one of the 50 names.
Another is long beard. He has a big beard. Yeah. Another thing, he flies in the sky at night. He's associated with this. His folk in post-pagan times, Odin didn't disappear. He kind of merges into different kinds of folklore, into this kind of guy, the night rider, the Herne the Hunter, or he's the leader of a kind of night hunt, a fearsome man who rides in the sky at night, and he collects the souls of the dead. And actually, the original Yule feast, it seems to have been related to the dead to some extent. Like it's a big family event, and everyone comes together and drinks and eats and does stuff like we do now. But also there was a kind of association with the dead, and Odin, the Lord of the Dead. So we're not sure exactly what it was, but it's something going on there. Yeah. And maybe that was preserved, and that the Yule, the word Yule is the name of the pagan feast that happened in midwinter around somewhere close to where we now celebrate Christmas, not the exact same time, roughly the same time. Yeah. So definitely what we now have as Christmas has roots in old Germanic paganism, and certainly there are similarities between Father Christmas and Odin, but I don't think that the Christmas tree comes from paganism. I don't think that the Santa sleigh comes from paganism. But those are things that people often think do.
Well, Santa lives at the North Pole, and Odin lives in Asgard, across the Rainbow Bridge. And I grew up in a very northern part of Canada with a lot of where northern lights were very common. And you could easily see that the northern lights could be Bifrost, and it's across that you would then get into Asgard, which is the, where you find Santa.
It's a path from one world to the next, isn't it? And and his role in post-pagan times was a kind of a psychopomp, and pagan times and in post-pagan times, Christians believed in Odin as a kind of demon who came and took the dead, and then the pagans believed in him as a god who took the dead from one world to the next. And Sleipnir is a vehicle that does that. Yeah, but there certainly are those. There's something undeniably Odinic about Father Christmas. No doubt about that. But I just think people do overstate some of the things about it. The actual real common roots of Father Christmas's attributes are numerous and diverse and quite complicated. And I can't really be certain where they all come from. But they, for example, I've said that in Scandinavia they have the Yule Log, which was like a goat that people dress as a goat and then would go and give presents to the children and scare them a little bit. Well, you may be aware that become more popular in recent years that in alpine regions, they have something similar. The father of the house would dress up as a horned monster, and that monster would come and not give presents to the children, but scare them with whips, threaten to whip them.
This is like a Krampus or
Krampus,
Connect. Well, even like Connect Rupert is kind of like that, or like Zwarte Piet, Black Pete.
Zwarte Piet was it's nice though. He's he
does take you back to Spain. I mean, he does throw you in a sack and take you back to.
All right. Well, he used to give you coal. Well, I had a Dutch au pair when I was little, and she used to tell us on 6th December, because that's not Christmas Day, that's 6th December.
That's Nicholas Day, yeah.
Oh, right. Well, you put your shoes by the chimney, and if you're bad, you get coal. But since I was always bad, I always got coal. But they would give us coal made from sugar, so I could eat it.
Right.
But that Zwarte Piet is the idea of Saint Nicholas having a black slave.
Yeah.
So, but it's still controversial in Holland today about whether people should put black makeup on and dress up as Zwarte Piet. But there is a claim among some Dutch people that Zwarte Piet didn't originally represent a black slave of St. Nicholas, but some kind of spirit from pagan times who assisted another pagan figure who was Sinterklaas, and that these both have been transferred into the context of a Turkish saint and his black slave.
Right. Well, that's the thing. I mean, you have these sort of different polarities between these figures. You've got sort of like the light and the dark. You've got the Sinterklaas, but then you've got the Krampus, and just the light and the dark between the two. And it kind of makes sense that you would have, he's Black Pete for a reason. It's kind of just he's the opposite of a Santa in a way, or of that character. Yeah, it's a shadow. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. It's sort of the shadow figure in this,
Well, then you could say there were both elements of an Odinic something going back. Certainly, Odin would have been worshipped in Holland, Germany, England, Scandinavia, but but maybe not so much in the Alps. Well, certainly during Germanic times, but a lot. I mean, the Alps have been Christian for quite a long time, so it's a bit confusing. I don't know how much. The Alps has a really rich folklore, which I'm not that knowledgeable about, but. Maybe the Krampus derives from the same thing as Yule Log derives from. They're both horned and they both knock on the door. But the Yule Log, as far as I can tell, has always been friendly, unlike Krampus.
Yeah. And when it gets into the Alps, that's kind of weird too, because if you go over the hill, you'll find a little pocket of people who have their own language and their own cultures and all. And that's the thing too, when you have these people that are scattered, they end up not moving around as much as we think they do. Most people didn't all become, international, whatever, people stayed fairly local and developed their own sort of customs within that area. And there'd be some crossover, but then you'd still have variation among them. So, and I guess that's where Reconstructionism is sort of odd to me, because when it's so fuzzy and gray, I think it's quite difficult to reconstruct something when you're also basing it off of material that is often suspect as well. If you like looking at, say, old like Norse mythology and this kind of thing, a lot of that stuff was written down by Christians. So how much is really, yeah, well, exactly. So how much is really, what's authentic, what's not? And
that's something that's what academics have been, disputing for the last 200 years and getting to the heart of. But there are ways of, it's hard discipline, but there are ways of finding stuff out. But folklore is not as reliable a source as medieval. Obviously, something written down in the 13th century is going to be a better window into the 10th century than something that a 19th century Germany says. But that doesn't mean that folklore has no value, because it's really interesting. Even if it isn't actually a perfectly preserved fossil of what pagans used to do, it's just a really cool and interesting insight into a vibrant and fascinating culture. What the people in the Alps do, what people in Sweden do. This is cultural heritage of Europe. It's really fascinating. It needs to be preserved.
Absolutely.
No matter where it comes from.
Yeah, and I think actually, to me personally, just the way that I'm wired, I find the gaps actually fascinating. I love the gaps in there because to me, that's where the mystery is and that's where the wonder is. And that's kind of where the magic is because you don't fully know and it lets your imagination open up. And
right, that's what Christmas is like when you're little, right? You don't know.
Yeah.
The guy, how did he get in the house? How did he fit down the chimney?
Exactly.
These kind of things just fill you with wonderment. And that's kind of like the magical feeling that makes children love Christmas as part of what everyone likes about it's a part of human nature that we love that kind of thing.
Yeah, it kind of opens you up. And so where there are these gaps, that's where the real fun of exploration and what if comes in. And it keeps you flexible, keeps your mind open.
As an artist, I bet you get that. There's an opportunity there that presents.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess what would you call it? Like artistic license could maybe just be another word for lying. You could look at it like that, or you could look at it as just a way to explore and this kind of thing. So yeah, what else is there? There's there's mistletoe. That connects very obvious to.
There's an easy connection to paganism with mistletoe because mistletoe features so prominently in Nordic myth because it's the only living organism or a biological like plant or animal or anything in the whole universe that doesn't obey the command not to hurt the white god Balder, and as a result is used as a dart to kill him. But however, that doesn't. Whereas that doesn't really have any obvious link to the way that mistletoe plays into folk custom of Christmases in Europe, which is very sexual. And like some people point out that the berries of mistletoe do kind of resemble certain human emissions.
Right. Emissions, that's a good word. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the mistletoe is not the mistletoe's connotation in Norse myth is that it's cursed and bad. It's something you don't want to be around. Whereas mistletoe in Christmas means you might get a kiss on, Right. So it's quite different. Is there a direct connection in those meanings there? I'm not certain, but certainly mistletoe was important in paganism, and also Celtic paganism has mistletoe is prominent. That it's a thing that the Druids were. I can't remember what for, but I know that the Druids were known to be interested in mistletoe. Okay. So mistletoe is a very pagan, a sacred plant in most European pagan things in this region, Northern Europe. So maybe that's how it's just become this romantic thing that people hang it in the house. And originally it was hung in the house for a totally different reason, but now it's hung in the house because then you have an opportunity to give someone a kiss. Right.
And so Balder he's the white god. He's seen as the most beautiful of the gods, and he's killed by this bit of mistletoe that Loki, the trickster, gets Hoder to throw at him. And Hoder's the blind god. And I wonder, do you think that there's some sort of convenient thing there with Christianity where Balder could then be construed, like could be seen as Jesus, and Hoder being the blind god could be the ignorance of the people, and the devil Loki convincing them to kill. Is there anything there, or is that just goofy?
Short answer, no. But a longer answer is that's not a bad theory, and it's been acknowledged as a potential theory for I think since the 18th century. So like as soon as people like Icelandic literature, these like sagas like in Icelandic literature were around non-stop in Iceland, but they were kind of discovered by the rest of Europe only in the 18th century. And they basically, like in the 18th century, like Icelandic literature is something like, oh, this is very interesting. Everyone starts reading it. And then like late 19th century, the Romantic movement, like German Romanticism, and also just British antiquarians who love reading old stuff, everyone became very interested in it. And a lot of people noticed quite obviously the Christ, the parallel of Baldwin and Christ are quite similar. Yeah. But Jackson Crawford, who's an old Norse philologist on YouTube, has done a good video like where he says like they're not these kind of themes are common in a lot of pre-Christian stuff to the extent that
for sure
coincidental, and there's not enough specific references to make it like obviously a reference to Christ. And also it doesn't really serve much of a function. I mean, if it was Snorri's intention to demonstrate that the Icelanders had already understood the meaning of Christ's sacrifice prior to the introduction of Christianity there, he would have laid that on thick, because that would be, he was a Christian and he wanted to validate his pagan ancestors. The reason that he wrote all this stuff down is because even though he's a Christian, he wants to feel proud of his ancestors and not that they were just evil, pagan, bad people. So he's trying to validate them. So if he was trying to do, if that was his intention, I think he would have laid it on a lot more thickly and just said, you know, this shows how we were always ready to receive the doctrine of Christ or something like that. It doesn't say that. So I don't think so. I don't think so. No.
Well, and if there's anyone that's sort of Christ-like, that you could sort of awkwardly superimpose that onto Norse mythology, it would probably be Odin. I mean, you have a figure who sacrifices himself to himself, hangs from a tree to gain knowledge, all this kind of stuff. And, you know, if you had to, although, you could, I mean, it's a real,
you can stretch it a lot, but you should also bear in mind that if we had been, if Europe had been Buddhist instead of Christian, we'd probably be making Buddhist parallels instead.
Yeah, exactly.
Buddha sat under a tree and he meditated. Oh, and Odin went on a tree and he then was received wisdom. And like, you know what I mean? It's like we've been raised as Christians, so we are compelled to see Christian parallels. Right. That doesn't mean that there's a Christian origin to these things, at all. I think,
and that's where it gets interesting to me, because when people bring up, say, let's get back to the spirit of Christmas, let's not forget the true meaning of Christmas. That's when my brain kind of goes, well, okay, what is that true meaning of Christmas? Because it's you know,
everyone's got the true meaning. Like, as far as
that's exactly it.
In the 15th century, Christmas wasn't Christian enough. And I mean, even I think, you know, you can see like Anglo-Saxon bishops complaining about how pagan stories were still being celebrated and everything was too pagan still. Hundreds of years, I'm talking about the 10th century and 9th century, and the Anglo-Saxons were like fully converted by the 8th century, like most of them converted by the 7th century. So you're talking about hundreds of years after they've been Christian, and they're still invoking and this is, he's talking about, sorry, not about general public, he's talking about monks. So he's talking about the monks, when they sit around, they start telling stories of pagan heroes. And that's hundreds of years after conversion. So basically, paganism was still a really massive thing in the English imagination, hundreds of years after conversion, even among clerical figures. So that's testament to the importance of this old mythology. And I'm sure around Europe, you see, I mean, by the 10th century, the Scandinavians hadn't fully converted, and over in the Baltic, the Lithuanians didn't convert for several hundred years after that even. So paganism has like an enduring effect on our psyche long after we nominally accepted Christ. So I think Christmas has certainly a lot. I mean, it's widely acknowledged to have a lot of non-Christian elements, not just Nordic ones, because there's also the influence that of the Roman feast of midwinter, Saturnalia.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is the feast of Saturn. If you look at like how people celebrated, what we have reports of how in the early modern era, like the time of Shakespeare, how they celebrated Christmas in England, it does resemble very much how we have Roman accounts of Saturnalia being celebrated in Rome, because they say in Rome, Saturnalia, it was like upside down day, where the the slaves could be the masters and the masters would be the slaves, and everyone would reverse roles. Men could put on girls' clothes, boys' clothes, whatever. Everything crazy upside down. Well, in 15th century England, they'd take the stupidest guy in the village and he'd put a crown on him, and he'd be the lord of misrule, the king for the day. And basically everyone had to do what he said, and he'd tell everyone to do ridiculous things. And so, you know, the idea is that, like, it's a liminal time. It's a time between times. It's in the, you know, it's like in the between one year and the next. Right. And it's kind of a time when anything goes, and you can behave in ways that you wouldn't normally, and you shouldn't normally to behave. And so people drink more than normal. People behave very oddly. People, like, class roles are inversed, things like that. Yeah. And that's how people understood Christmas, not about the birth of Christ, until quite recently. I mean, the church was always trying to tell you it was about the birth of Christ, but as even I think a lot of people know, there's no evidence at all that Jesus was born in December. That was a later innovation to try and cover up all these crazy things going on in December all across Europe. And they were like, let's just make this the holy period of the birth of Christ. Since we don't really know when Jesus was born, it makes sense we just sort of use this to get rid, like, to kind of Christianize these crazy customs where people get drunk and do silly things.
Right, right. I know that I think it's either Cologne or Frankfurt. I think it's one of those. It's, yeah, either or, I'm not sure. But they still do. There's a huge celebration, but I think it's in February. I think it's a little bit later, but it's this carnival type thing where they do the whole role reversal, costumes, parades, all this kind of stuff. And it's sort of like, it's like a topsy-turvy day where everything's upside down. And it's very much like that. So it's sort of, you know, the date's over here, but yeah, you still have these pockets of that kind of thing that takes place. And it's just, yeah, it's these leftovers.
It's a pressure valve, social pressure valve.
Oh, for sure.
Everyone wants to, like, sometimes you want to just let loose and do whatever you like. And you know what? Even if all our culture didn't exist, like, I'm sure something the same would emerge anyway, because it's just a natural thing. We want to have these pressure valves. A day when kids can get away with doing stuff they can't normally get away with. A day when people can just let loose, drink a little bit more than normal. That kind of thing. Also a day when we can be, you know, send presents or letters to people we don't talk about. Don't talk to as much as we all wish we did. These kind of things. It's like these special occasions in the calendar have that social function that is higher. It goes beyond. It fills a very functional purpose besides the religious one.
Yeah, yeah. And during winter as well, you've got it can be such a miserable time of the year, you know, and pretty brutal. And so it only makes sense that around the solstice, you've got these sort of events taking place. And it's the same thing with, like, with harvest festivals. You know, Thanksgiving is not a Christian invention. It's simply harvest. That's all it is. It's the end of harvest, and you throw a party when you're done. Harvest is a lot of work, you know, and when you're done, you want to reward yourself and throw a party. It's as simple as that. And, you know, whether it's Oktoberfest or Thanksgiving, it's the same thing. It's still a harvest festival.
Well, I went to Catholic school in England, and we didn't have Oktoberfest or Thanksgiving, but we just called it Harvest Festival.
There you go.
We literally all bring in vegetables and tins of food and just put them down at the altar and like give them to God. I mean, it's paganism.
It's the same thing.
It's about as pagan as you can get. We're giving part of our crop every year to the gods.
Right. You're making a sacrifice at an altar for your bounty. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's just preserved. And that's in England. I mean, where it's not even a Catholic country, but I mean, a lot of Irish people were there in the school or whatever. But I mean, it's the same all across Europe. Something like that happened.
Yeah.
It's quite a natural thing. It goes with what I believe, that paganism is a natural human behavior. Paganism is the religious impulse manifesting naturally in human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's like the cycle of nature, and it really makes me wonder too. When you look, you know, we have to kind of, if you look at our present calendar, if we had a different calendar, like say the 13th month calendar, that kind of blows my mind. When you have a 13-month calendar, because every month has exactly 28 days. And so it's this clockwork of nature that I find really fascinating, because you've got 28-day months, 13 months. You know, there's a Friday the 13th every month. And then at the end of the year, there's one day that's intermission, basically. And then the calendar starts up again. And to me, that seems like such a much more logical, it's in tune with nature. For instance, like, women's cycles would be like clockwork according to this calendar. Every month you would know exactly when that's coming. And with children giving birth, like now when you give birth, it's, it's actually more like 10 months, not 9 months in that.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's completely weird. So I think that if you go back, I mean, we're sort of under these Gregorian calendars and that have been kind of puzzled together, but something as simple as that having this sort of at that, like, I mean, it seems like it's more fitting, and that people at that time were much more in tune with the cycles of nature than we are now.
We don't know exactly what kind of calendar the Germanic people had, but we do know that it was, I mean, how many months they had, but we know that it had, the month was literally, month comes from moon. So literally, like, it begins at the full moon is the end of one month and the beginning of the next.
Yeah.
So however many months there are in a year is how many moons there are. So it's literally done by the moon. And so it was a solar lunar, but that means that the actual Yule, because Yule is that we think of Christmas as a day, Yule was actually a 2-month period within which there was a massive feast and several other minor feasts, and they are said to have lasted for the Norse. Like, I mean, the Anglo-Saxons say that there were several other feasts in that Yule period, but Yale in Old English. But the Yule in Norse is like 2 months within which there was this feast, but we don't know when exactly it was. But if we know that the month literally means like the moons, then it probably was at the moon in between the two months, right? So it was in the dead center of it, which might actually be more close to what we call somewhere in January, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's actually interesting because as parts of England, we do a whole load of folk celebrations about wassailing. Wassail is the old Anglo-Saxon thing, meaning be healthy. It's like an old pagan thing to say, be healthy, like a greeting.
Right.
As well as meaning carol singing and as well as meaning a hot cider drink. But that happens generally in the first 2 weeks of January.
Right.
So maybe that goes back to all the way back to the Yale month. Who knows?
The calendar thing is just like my most recent baddie YouTube rabbit hole. That's all that is.
Yeah, you can go down it a long way. I got a friend who he's got really, really intricate calculations for when he thinks that the actual pagan celebrations should be based on the sources and on the position of the moon. So it's a rabbit hole you can go really deep into.
For sure.
My brain when I think about it too much.
Right. So very obvious Christmas things. Christmas trees. So where do you think, is that just part of the tradition of bringing the outside inside?
Well, that yes and no, but I mean, here's the thing. There's always been traditions I know in England especially, but also probably other parts of Europe, definitely have been traditions where you take greenery and decorate the house on certain days. We still do that on May Day, for example. We call it bringing in the May. May also, as well as the month of May, means a blossom of hawthorn. So you take hawthorn blossom, that's called a branch of May. So bringing in the May means taking hawthorn blossom branches and just decorating them on the house. And stuff like that, equivalent to that, different plants, different times of year, common around Europe. But there is no tradition attested of bringing pine trees in to the house anywhere until this Christmas tree tradition comes. And it was not, and what we understand it to have come from is the German Protestants adopted it from the Baltic, like Lithuanian peasants, after the Prussians colonized. When the Prussians formed an aristocracy in Lithuanian, like the Baltic peoples, and the Baltic peoples may have done something where they decorated their houses with pine, and the Germans copied it, or originally didn't decorate the house. They had a single pine in the center. They brought a pine into the center of town and decorated that. And then the Germans copied that, and the Lutheran, associated with Lutheran Christmas practices in Germany. And that was originally, I think, sometimes in the early modern period, like 16th century or something. And by the 19th century, it was quite a well-established tradition in Germany to bring a pine tree into the town, or even they started bringing them into the home. And then the royal family in Britain copied the German royal family And after that, once in Britain, if the royal family did something, everyone does it after that. And then the Americans did it as well, and everyone does it. And but no.
Let's hope that isn't the case with Prince Andrew. Let's hope that that's something that he kind of keeps to himself.
No comment. But
sorry, just derailed it. But go ahead.
The Christmas tree. Certainly, the idea of one thing we know is. Maybe the Christmas tree is just a 15th century, 16th century German invention or Lithuanian invention or something like that. Germans copying Lithuanians in a different way. Maybe it's not actually pagan. Or maybe it is, and that it came from a Lithuanian pagan thing that the Germans copied and we don't understand it anyway. But because Lithuanian paganism doesn't really have any special association with pine trees either, nor does German paganism, Norse paganism. They mention many sacred trees in Germanic religion, Celtic religion, but never pine trees. No one has ever said pine trees are sacred, so it doesn't make sense that it's a pine tree. But there is a tradition in Germanic cultures of the Yule Log, and that would be a very different thing. Before, it was like bringing a log into the house, and that was not a living log; it was like a dead log. And the Yule Log is a separate thing from the Christmas tree. And people associate them now, and like now in England, the only thing we have left of the Yule Log tradition, which was a massive tradition in England, is to have sometimes a cake in the shape of a log. But most people don't even do that because Christmas puddings have become a more popular thing. I don't know if in North America Yule Logs are a big thing. But
when I was a kid, we did Yule Logs. We would they'd be like, it would be a log like roughly this large, and you'd kind of
an actual log.
An actual log, and you would decorate it, drill little holes in the top and put candles in it, and it would be like a table centerpiece sort of thing that we would do. So, but that was our family, and I'm pretty sure I'm positive we even did these in school. But then again, the school that I went to, it was just it's all Scandinavians, so there's some leftovers of that.
Scandinavians don't do Yule Logs either. Like I spent several Christmases in Sweden. No one does Yule Logs. It's not a thing there.
Weird.
The Yule Log was an English thing for a long time, and that's one of the only times the word Yule in English with Y-U-L-E comes from Old English Yale, G-E-O-L, and it's obviously the same root as Swedish Jul, which is J-U-L, which comes from Old Norse Jol, J-O-L. But the log is more likely than most other Christmas traditions to have a pagan origin. But it's not mentioned in any sources that we can prove that, but it's just completely unrelated to anything from Christian tradition, and it's very, it feels very pagan. They're bringing logs inside, decorating them and venerating them in some way. It may be something from Anglo-Saxon paganism, because I haven't heard about it in Norway or Iceland. They don't do it in Norway, Iceland, or Sweden. So it may be something the Anglo-Saxons brought to England. And the fact that we kept the name Yule when even in Anglo-Saxon times, the word Christmas came in to start to replace Yale. But we've preserved the term Yule mainly in reference to the Yule Log. So it's very, it's one of the only contexts where we always use the word Yule. We never call it a Christmas log. We always call it a Yule log.
Right. Yeah.
So even when we're talking about these cakes.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. No, that's
so
true.
It's very, it does seem that, I think that's a very strong argument to be made that is pagan origin, stronger than the Christmas tree argument.
Well, the Christmas thing, the Christmas tree thing as well. One of the things that I've heard is that, pagans used to sacrifice rabbits and animals, and they would hang them from a tree, and then the red balls that we've got on the tree are actually representations of the blood of these animals, and they would, decorate them around. And
I've heard that too, and it's true that they did sacrifice animals, and it's true that they did hang them on a tree. But the baubles are a German invention from recent times. So, and also the pine tree thing, we know that the hanging of animals on the tree happened on an ash tree, and that the sacred tree of Odin was an ash tree. So why is it a pine tree? It doesn't add up to me. Yeah. This pine tree tradition, Christmas trees have always been pine trees. There's not been a transition we can see where it used to be an ash and then they made it a pine tree. It's always been a pine tree, and it hasn't even come originally from a Germanic country. It's come from Germans in a Baltic country. So I don't think that's true. I think people are they know what pagans did with the hanging animals, and then they know what Christmas trees are, and they're trying to join up the dots. But there's not actually a real connection there. They're just making it up, I'm afraid. I don't believe that's right.
Like, you can watching too many episodes of Vikings. or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, the logic is sound. Like, they're correct to say that there was, you know, that the hanging of animals in trees, that pagans did that. But I think we can see a more clear origin of the Christmas tree in Christian Prussia. That's attested and proven, whereas the other theory just doesn't. We can't see a connection to pagan times at all. Because also remember, if we're talking about it's German and not Scandinavia, then we don't have to go just back to the 13th or back to the 10th century or 12th century. We've got to go way back to when the Saxons were converted by Charlemagne, which is much further back in time. Yeah, because Christianity has been in Germany much longer than Scandinavia, so it makes it even harder. That's not to say that Christian countries don't preserve pagan customs. Like the Balkans were pagan, have been Christian for a very long time, but there's some extremely pagan customs all around the Balkans. Yeah, and in Sardinia, very pagan customs in Sardinia, and that's been Christian for a very long time. So sometimes Christianity can, and Ireland too. Ireland has been Christian for longer than England or Germany, but it's got some things going on in Ireland that look very pagan. So just because it became Christian early doesn't mean they don't preserve old pagan customs. Right.
Yeah, I for me, from my point of view, I lived in Germany for quite some time, and Christmas was such an amazing, just magical time of the year. I mean, it was so great just to walk. You're walking down the streets, and it's just you've got this smell of candy in the air, and it's just the glue wine, and there was such an amazing vibe to it and spirit around at that time of the year. And I really miss it, just because here in Canada we've kind of stripped all of that away in a sense, and we've kind of I mean, there's the odd little Santa Claus parade or something like that, and it's nice, and you participate in these things because you still want to contribute and be a part of what little is left. But it's we could really do with a boost of this sort of tradition.
One thing I've seen Christmas celebrated in the USA, Sweden, Italy, Germany, Ireland, and England with my own eyes. Is that the German Christmas market is everywhere. Like there is something about Christmas globally now that is German. Like German Christmas has become the standard of Christmas that everyone in the world measures up Christmas to. Like the Christmas market is a German Christmas market. And the things they sell there are very German, like Stollen is people in England eat Stollen now at Christmas. So German culture has really made just as Irish culture is kind of like permeated through Halloween a bit. German culture has become a bit global through Christmas, because it's become, I don't know how, is it Hawaii? Well, partly because of the British royal family, partly because of the German immigrants in the USA. There's something about Christmas that just feels very German.
Yeah, and I mean, I think once you're sort of immersed in that, it's such a tragic thing to lose. I mean, seeing as I was immersed in that for so long, and then now when Christmas comes around, it's like there's this big hole of like, but I really want to go to a Christmas market, that kind of thing. So you could see why you'd want to recreate that. I mean, I desperately want to, like, I don't know, my 5-year project is the town that I'm kind of around. I want to get a Christmas market going and do it right, because they have no idea what they're missing, and they have to be
I saw Christmas markets in Washington State and things. I saw even in Seattle they have like Yule Box and stuff, like Swedish Christmas stuff. So I thought that Canada would have a Christmas market.
Well, I mean, it's few and far between. Like say around where I am, I'm in Ontario, the GTA. I'm outside of the GTA, the Greater Toronto area, but yeah, there's very few. It's a spotting of markets, and to be honest, they're kind of it's just not the same. It's just not the same. They're missing out on that thing of
hot booze, like you said, glue vine or mulled cider or something, or mulled wine or something. Right. You got to have the smells of sugar in the air, like candies or hot pancakes or something. I don't know, like waffles, I guess. What something like that. Maybe sausages, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
In Italy, what I miss, I used to spend a lot of Christmases in Milan because my family lived there for well over 10 years. And every Christmas I used to go there to Milan. And Milan is, quite near the Alps. So it's quite a Germanized part of Italy. And chestnuts roasting on the streets everywhere. That is really Christmassy smell of chestnuts roasting in the streets. Like we have association of chestnuts in England too, but no one roasts them in the street and sells them in the street. Like in Italy, that's great.
Yeah, yeah. And we got to bring this stuff back because it's it's all part of the magic of the season. That's the thing. And that's why, I don't know, I love this time of the year so much because it's just, people start to shift into a different mode. And I think it's nice to kind of see, even though a lot of stuff has been lost, there's still a commonality of we're all kind of communally sharing in a moment together for the most part. We're all on the same page that it's Christmas now. And there's at least some kind of unity within communities and this kind of thing, because we are all on the same page and we still do participate in this celebration. So we should probably wrap it up pretty quick. Tell me about the Spirit of Yule book that we did. I'll get you to get into it.
Well, I say that it's a book. It's a graphic novel, beautifully illustrated by a great artist. It's like a ghost story, because actually one tradition that I wanted to bring back is the Christmas ghost story. It began with Dickens, you could say, because Dickens has, in Christmas Carol, 3 ghosts come, but it's been continued in Britain in a big way by the BBC, where they had this ghost story for Christmas thing, or these folk horrors thing. And I think even though Christmas has that thing you talked about, with this togetherness and this warm, fuzzy feelings, there's also something kind of spooky about Christmas. And I think The Nightmare Before Christmas kind of picked up on that. Like, Tim Burton's understands there's something that Halloween and Christmas have in common. It's hard to understand what, but it goes way back. And I wanted to bring that into it. So it's kind of a spooky book. A guy, he's been to Christmas church on Christmas Eve, a midnight mass, and then he gets transported through time by a mystical figure called the Green Knight into the pagan times when Yule existed and Christmas was something totally different, and his mind gets blown by what he sees and he gets really scared. And it's kind of like a fun story that you can read to your kids and enjoy. Adults can learn from it, but also kids can learn, and they can get a little bit scared, but not too much. So I think it's a great gift for anyone with kids, if you've got nephews or nieces or whatever, they will be happy. And it's kind of a great Christmas thing to have, because like I said, it's, even if you're an adult, it's really got a lot of information. It's like I probably researched everything in it. Like, it's a real insight into what paganism, what Yule was like in pagan times, but done in a fun way.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. Awesome. Yeah, and the link will be in the description for that, and hopefully everybody picks up a copy. I'm quite proud of it. I think it's really cool. I think that's about it. There you go.
Merry Christmas to all.
Merry Christmas.
All a good Yule.
All right. Okay. Well, this is my first ever interview thing. So, if I was a little bit of a marble mouth or mush mouth, I hope you bared with me and stick around, and see everybody later. Cheers.
Cheers.